Okay, good morning. Thank you to the forum for inviting me. I was asked to say something about the state of the world's young children, all 2 billion of them. I thought it was a rather narrow topic, so I decided that in addition to the state, I'm going to say something about not just the state, but the trend in well-being, and as well as the drivers, the broad drivers of those trends. And so my short answer to the question about the trends in the well-being of the world's children is that children are growing up increasingly global, but at the same time they're also growing up unequal. And the specific points that I'm going to make throughout the presentation are as follows. First of all, I'm going to make the case that they're growing up increasingly unequal. Then I'm going to say that these inequalities are layered and can be found at 3 concentric levels. You can look at inequalities between countries, within countries and across families, and then within families. So this is sort of a very broad schematic that you can use to examine these inequalities. Then some of the drivers, not all of them, are profoundly demographic, and I'm going to insist on those demographic factors, and they have to do with questions of dependency and caregiving, age structure, but most importantly with transformations that are happening within families. And there would be 4 broad transformations that I'm going to discuss. They relate differently to different regions of the world, but they're kind of relevant to some extent across the world. And finally, I'm going to discuss opportunities to act now. They are programmatic. The MDG Plus would provide an opportunity to energize national governments and societies, especially in the developing world, to mobilize in favor of young children. There's the agenda of emergence in the specific context of African countries. Countries are pretty excited about the potential for quite a few of them to rise to the status of emerging country, and that presents an opportunity to mobilize local energies. And finally, there's the opportunity to reap what is called a demographic dividend. And so to seize these opportunities, I think there would be a need for this group, as well as other initiatives, to build, to frame what I call a life course, child-centric approach to development. That is an alternative or complement to the standard way we tend to think about processes of building economic development in low-income countries, which is essentially to think of development as resulting from what I would call macroeconomic magic. You tweak some macroeconomic variables and voila, you reach development. Instead, I would suggest that there's also the potential to build on this alternative approach, which would be to nurture, cultivate the current generation of children in a way that is going to be fairly systematic, culturally sensitive, and let that generation carry the process of socioeconomic development. Now, again, I'm going to focus my attention on 3 levels of inequality: inequality between countries, within countries, and within families. And as you go through this, you can look at inequality in terms of very specific substantive outcomes, such as health, nutrition, education, and so forth. But that's not my comparative advantage. We have UNESCO here, we have UNICEF, we have the World Bank, and I'm pretty sure they're going to do a much better job than I can on this question. So I focus my attention not on the outcomes or the outputs, but rather on the input side, specifically the family environments that provide these inputs and the characteristics of these families as they provide time, resources, care, attention, nurturing, contact, and so forth. So my focus is going to be on families and inputs. Okay. Now, the first if you look at this, typically you can understand why one may need to be interested in inequalities within countries, but when we need to discuss inequality between countries, you raise a question mark. Why should we worry about inequality between countries among children? After all, children live within national boundaries. And there may be reason to explain why there's a need for interest in between countries inequality. And the point is this, that is, children essentially are growing up more and more global. You can blame it on the Cosby Show, you can blame it on the rise of TV, the internet, mass communication, you can blame it on other forms of direct international contact, but the reality is that today's children are growing up in an environment where the aspiration and even the expectations are converging in matters of family life as well as life aspirations. And so that's why we are paying attention to inequality between countries. And if you look at the picture of that inequality, this is a story of good news, bad news. The good news, and the curve here shows you the level of dollar spent per education dollar spent per child and the inequality between countries of the world. And the trend is that this inequality, and that's the good news, has been declining. Okay, it's been historically declining. There's been a little bit of convergence in how much different countries allocate on average in terms of their education dollar per child. But the bad news, or not so good news, is that this level of inequality is still high. It's high compared to the inequality in GDP per capita between countries. So inequality among children, to say it otherwise, is larger than inequality among the general population. Okay, that's the point. But to take this even further, you can look at sort of differences in actual dollars, relative differences in the relative burden of child rearing, which is a measure that captures both the resources that a country has and the number of children that it has to take care of. And so if you take, let's say, an average country in the middle here, could be Panama, and how much money they spend per child, let's say it's $100, what this chart shows is the number of children who need to share that $100. Okay? And that number can be greater than 1, and this is the case for all the countries here. You have at the very bottom the Democratic Republic of Congo that need to share that $100 among 55 children, compared to other countries here at the top where it would share it among, let's say, a quarter of a child. Okay, so enormous differences across countries in the resources available per child. So yes, there is a decline in the inequality, but these inequalities remain pretty large. Now, why have these inequalities been declining? Okay, decline itself is a good trend, but when we look at the structure of this decline, you can actually, this is the result of a decomposition analysis, and you can see where the decline is coming from, and you can break this down in terms of the world region, where the decline is coming from, as well as the processes that drive the decline. And what you can see is a very simple story in which a lot of the global convergence is driven by Asia's economic growth. Other regions have not participated. Sub-Saharan Africa in particular hasn't participated. So a lot of the decline, all of it actually, has been driven by Asians' economic growth. In terms of process, you can see here there are 3 processes considered. One is relative convergence in the size of countries, relative convergence in the age structure of countries, and relative convergence in economic productivity. And the driving force has been just the convergence in economic productivity due to this. So in a sense, the lack of demographic convergence has been a break in fostering the convergence in the resources available per child. Okay, and that's something that needs to be addressed. Sorry. Okay. Now, if we shift between countries, you also see that demographic forces do have the same breaking influence. And we are going to look at 4 aspects of families that are important in building or sustaining inequality between children. The first is family size, and in this case, you have within families what we call asymmetric fertility transition, which is to say in countries, especially in African countries, where you have declines in fertility, these declines tend to occur mostly among the higher SES groups. And the result of this is that you increasingly have large differences in birth fertility rates between the top socioeconomic quintile and the bottom socioeconomic quintile. In some countries like Liberia, for instance, here in the middle you can see the top quintile has roughly 3 children on average, and the bottom has 8. It's a huge difference. So when you compound differences in fertility with differences in income and social capital and human capital, you're actually setting the stage for enormous differences in children's circumstances. Okay. So one element of families is increasing differences in SIP size that are aligned with SES. A second difference or another aspect of family size is family structure. And this is the McClanahan thesis, which is essentially that you have a gradient in terms of age at marriage, maternal employment, and premarital fertility. These outcomes tending to favor women who are more educated. And this, again, tends to raise inequality among the current generation of children. This is something that is supposed to be most relevant to lower income, lower fertility societies, but I think it applies more generally. Another family feature is nucleation. In African countries in particular, the extended family system and the tendency to foster children, have them taken care of by a relative, has been a very effective buffer against inequality. And so today the question is whether this buffer is still operating or whether it's going to erode. And it can erode in many different ways. It can erode because fewer and fewer children are being fostered out. It can erode because the fosterage becomes more and more selective, and this is a thesis that Ann Case and colleagues have put forward. That is, fosterage rates remain high, but they become more selective. And so those who have access to fosterage are not necessarily those who need it the most, and so it's not going to buffer inequality as well as in the past. Or fosterage can still exist but be less effective. You still take in your relatives' children, but you don't take care of them as profoundly as you used to before. So it's an open question how this transformation in this particular feature of families is going to affect inequality. The fourth feature of families that is relevant here is the extent of marital homogamy. That is the tendency for people to marry level in terms of their education or in terms of the income. And if you have this kind of homogamy, then you are likely to reinforce inequalities. If the rich marry the rich, and as seems to be increasingly the tendency, not the rich, but the educated marry the educated, as seems to be increasingly the tendency in the US, according to Schwartz and Mayer, then you are increasing inequality as well. So on all these counts, if you just consider transformations in families, they are likely to be conducive to greater inequality among children in the world. Within family, there's sort of the big concern that one can explore here, in addition to questions of disability, is the gender differences in the treatment of children within families. The data on education suggests there's been a little bit of convergence. But the question is how this convergence happens. You have here 2 countries that are converging, if you assume that parity is getting darker and darker here. But the modes in which they converge are different. Here you have a convergence that is sort of across the board. All socioeconomic groups converge at the same time. Whereas here you have a top-down convergence. And the policies that would apply to each one versus the other this type are going to be fundamentally different. Okay, so the question is, if you are worried about the state of the world population, what I show here is that, well, it's not so great if you are concerned about inequality. And so what are the opportunities for action? There are 3 overlapping opportunities, and I'm just going to list them here quickly. One is the MDG, MDG plus. Hopefully there'll be more stringent expectations regarding children, more expectation, but also greater emphasis on inequality. Then there's emergence in Africa. Many countries are attempting to set the bar to become an emerging country. And so this is both agenda are a source of mobilization. And then there's the possibility, or at least the hypothesis, of a demographic dividend, which is the notion that within, let's say, in the next few years and for some time, these countries are entering a phase of their fertility transitions where age dependency rates are going to be relatively low, and that provides an opportunity to invest in socioeconomic development and invest in children. And so these are three opportunities that are present in the near future. And when you think about this picture, in particular, the agenda of emergence in sub-Saharan Africa, the common date that is set is 2035. Many countries peg that date as the time when they expect to emerge. What I'm trying to tell them in the conversation I've had since is that nothing magical is going to happen in 2035. The time is now, and the focus is on children today. The generation that is going to emerge is already born, and if you want to emerge in 2035, the thing to do is to invest and nurture the current generation of children. Okay. So how to take action? There are two avenues. One is conceptual, and is more or less framing this child-centric approach to development, which is based on principles that we have highlighted here. One is simply the notion that, well, childhood is not Las Vegas. What happens in childhood doesn't stay in childhood. It actually keeps with you through the rest of your life. And so if you nurture today's generation, they are able to carry the process forward, and then you reap the benefit in due time. Okay. So build that notion, conception of development, and the relationship between generation that Bondi was talking about a little bit earlier. And also, in addition to conceptually, strategically, it's essentially building alliances like what we have here, where you have people from different horizons that bring their thinking together and that cross-breed ideas. And hopefully the mix of these ideas is going to generate new ways to address the challenge of development. And that could go a long way in promoting growth in low-income countries. Okay, and this is on a minor scale, a forum like just what we have here. This was a panel of African scientists working. Somebody was talking about capacity building. Under the Hewlett Foundation, we have an effort to think about the potential for African countries to reap a dividend. And so this effort associates a few universities, scientists in Africa, but also the UNFPA planning ministries, and we put our ideas together to see what are the realistic chances and what are the policy measures that need to be put in place in order to capture the dividends, so to speak. Okay. And so I will stop here with just the cost of action or the rewards, the cost of inaction and the rewards for action. I can comment on this chart a little bit later if need be. But it's essentially to say that the rewards are real. Many African countries, several African countries have a realistic chance to make a move forward if they bring together their best thinking, if they invest more of their resources in cultivating children, and if they also monitor what is happening within families and how they cultivate children. Thank you.
Thank you, Parfait, for that presentation. Next up, we have Mikey Chopra, who will, from UNICEF.